I design a system that where reconfiguration can happen in a continuous way.
Uh-huh.
In a continuous way, a little bit exactly like if you think of a pile of sand, like a wet pile of sand. When you deform it with your hand, you can to the shape that you want. And the grains are moving around each other in a continuous way. They can take all orientation possible. That wouldn't work with Lego. So you need to have
Yes.
like grains that can move around, right? And then the idea is instead of using your hand now, if you put little motors in each grain, uh, how can a very simple system just made of one actuator, how can this system um, basically reconfigure itself and develop its own autonomy and intelligence?
Hi everyone, my name is Balázs Kégl and this is the I Scientist podcast where we explore artificial intelligence, the body, and the soul. And today it's my great pleasure to host Baudouin Saintyves, who is a research staff scientist at the James Franck Institute of the University of Chicago. You are a physicist. You received your PhD in 2013 in physics at Sorbonne, France. And then you did a couple of postdocs at Harvard and MIT, and then you joined GFI in 2019, and you work on resilient and autonomous robotic approaches based on physics of soft and granular matter, and we'll explore all these topics. So how are you today, Baudouin?
I'm good. Thank you for having me, Balas.
So I want to explore basically three relating topics. One is the specific paper that was linked by a friend of mine, Daniel Barbashi, on Twitter, and it took my interest because for a lot of things that I will explain. But it's called Granulobots. These are sort of like soft robots, not the kind of humanoid that you see in the media. And we'll see. For me, it's very interesting from not only for the practical point of view of what you can do with it, but also from a theoretical point of view, how bottom-up things can emerge from such a system. So we will talk about it because I'm not that sure how easy it will be to describe because they are pretty visual, but we'll try. And then the next topic will be about, I want to explore with you a little bit distributed cognition and the TAME framework that comes from Michael Levin, who, by the way, I contacted before the interview, and he asked him what questions he would ask you, and he gave me 3 questions, and he says hi. So I'm very
Thanks.
excited because I think these things are really connected.
Mm.
That would be maybe the second third of the discussion, and the third one I'm very much interested in you because you had a very interesting sort of oscillation in your life between science and art, and that I find fascinating. So these are the things I would like to cover, and so let's start with so like basic definitions. Like people, when you say robot, and you think about even Tesla or even Boston Dynamics, what you would think about is this like animal or human-like machines that are sort of autonomous, right? And they are built by engineers. Maybe there is some AI, maybe there's some control in it, so they start to behave like intelligent agents, but they are very much engineered. Even though they look like us, inside it's very different. And so you work on soft robotics where you don't really see those kind of humanoid bodies on this. At the same time, you have a nice way to assemble robots from smaller parts, which for me resembles more like how life works. Like our parts are little agential things like cells or organs that they have their own goals and their own intelligent behavior, and we are sort of assembled from those little things up to our body. So this is the main reason why I'm so interested in this topic. But so let's start maybe with like the ontology of robotics. So what are these hard robots, the soft robots? You call them modular or swarm robots. So give us a little introduction on what are these different types of robotic approaches.
So basically, simple definition of what robotics is basically an embodied version of cybernetics. You have a system that can evolve in space and that can get some input from the environment and make decision to adapt to this environment. And the basic most so despite the fact, as you pointed it out, despite the fact that we build robots that look like biological systems, like animals in Boston Dynamics or humanoids, and things like this. They do operate very differently most of the time, and they generally use kinematic control, which and the underlying principle of this approach is a very deterministic. You try to find the smallest possible number of degrees of freedom, degrees of actuation in a system, and then try to control these degrees of freedom in displacement to do a task based on all the sensory input that you can get in your system, including things that can be very simple like touch sensors or more complex like computer vision, right? So and that approach it is quite limiting because um, if you want to develop systems that are more adaptable, generally you have to add more actuators, more sensors. And that means that if you use a kinematic approach, the complexity of your algorithm tend to increase very quickly, right? So what people have found in order to build systems that are more adaptable, because this system, generally kinematic system, tend to be better in a more controlled environment. So of course, Boston Dynamics is doing a very good job at uh, at making systems that are quite impressive in terms of adaptation, but it's at a huge cost in terms of complexity of the design. And like there is not a lot of companies that are able to do these robots. They are extremely expensive, and and they rely on a lot of sophistication, technological sophistication. So yeah, so a way people have, I mean, a quite encouraging development in robotics to make system more adaptable is soft robotics. In soft robotics, you use soft actuators, basically, typically actuators that are connected to soft bodies, and these bodies are compliant. They can adapt to forces from the coming from the environment, and allow robot to be a bit more adaptable. It's a big deal in the medical field because human can interact with robots. It's safer when you use software actuators. So soft robotics was a big evolution in the robotic field toward more adaptable systems.
So these robots are soft on the outside, or there is something different inside too? So the actuators are the same as in the hard robots, just the surface is softer, or they
You
work
are
differently inside?
Are you talking about specifically the system I developed or
No,
more in
no, no.
general
In
in
general,
soft
soft
robotics?
robots. Yeah, yeah.
It depends. There is many different systems that I've seen. Most of the time, you have like a soft body, typically made of silicone, and then you have a system of air pumps that allow to deform this structure. Less common, but it's under development. Is to use cable system with fabrics and system like this. So these systems are quite interesting for what they are bringing to the field of robotics. There is really some new. It's really opening a new range of application. But on another hand, it's still very complex to control them because now you don't have just an actuator that You don't just tell an actuator to deform of a certain amount of a certain angle or of a certain translation. You have to understand, you have to model the mechanic of the system. Generally, silicone materials have non-linear elasticity. That's something I've studied before being into robotics.
So you, the more
And
you press them, the more they answer, and it's not linear. Sometimes they get
Yeah,
like.
exactly. So a linear elastic system is basically when you just do small deformation, you increase you have a proportionality between the displacement and the force that you have to apply to the system to deform it. And now it's not with this material, it's not the case anymore, and it's intrinsic. Like these materials are interesting because they can deform a lot. And generally, when you reach large deformation, their behavior is not linear anymore. So that means that you have to integrate this in control, and that can get systems that are pretty complex.
Yeah, and so the
Uh,
control is still based on like trying to model your robot sort of top down, right? Simulators, and then try to solve some control problems and give the algorithm to the robot. It's also top down, right?
yeah, I would say yes, but some groups now are trying to actually develop with soft actuator an approach that is more a bit more. I wouldn't call it bottom up exactly, but they are implementing optimization loops
I see.
where you go through you first try you you do a first trial with like a guess, a design that is a guess on what could work well,
Hmm.
and then you, depending on the outcomes, you run another design iteration that optimize the outcomes. So
Okay.
it's somewhat it's becoming more complex than just top down approach at this point. Uh, yeah, and so and the other thing I wanted to mention. So yeah, maybe soft robotics is quite important in this picture because it's opening the a possibility to make robots that are more adaptable and more interactive. Another field of robotics that is quite interesting is distributed robotics. Um, so there is, I would say, two big categories in distributed robotics. One that I would call swarm robotics, and the other one modular robotics, right?
Hmm.
So in swarm robotics, it's more like dilute system. So the robots are not always they are generally not in a strong, they are not cohesive, and they are flocking together, more like birds flocking together. And the other category are modular robotic system, where the idea here is to build like structures that have some strength. Swarming system are more like liquids.
Okay.
We would call them like polar liquids in physics, like
Polar.
liquids, polar liquids. Like
Uh,
it come from analogies also with spin models, spin models that are adapted to this system, where instead of having just a up and down position, you have a whole range of angles, but you have the same rules of alignment that arise in the system, and you
So
can
they,
be
they
and
they have interactions between them, and then they also have some interaction with the environment. Some of them were outside, something like that.
so in that description, people were not looking at interaction with the environment. They were just looking at a bunch of spins that are trying to align with each other, and at the same time that are trying to stay cohesive,
I see.
and that
So
are going the spin represents the movement, so they are going straight. And then just with this, you can predict some flocking behavior. So that's the original idea. I'm referring to a paper in particular from Vicek I think it was published in '94.
okay, so this is
Uh,
getting closer to what you do, right? Because
it's
these flocks are they have control on the bottom level, and they sort of like a flock, like a swarming behavior emerges from it.
it's getting closer in the sense that there is some physical interaction in these models that can predict flocking. The big difference is that in my system, I'm using a condensed system. So it's like a cohesive system.
Yes.
So it's a modular robotic system, which means that you have units that can dock with each other, stick to each other, and you can build a cohesive aggregate.
So it's
So
like a little bit
in
like
that,
Lego in from that point of view, that they can
yeah,
stick together because they have magnets inside, but they can also move.
exactly.
I like Lego or
Exactly.
some version.
At one difference, there's one difference. So in modular robotics, it's actually more like Legos. You have systems that dock with each other with a specific configuration. I'm thinking of like the M block, for example, from Daniela Ru's lab at MIT. Um, which were quite impressive because these blocks are like autonomous. It's like squares that can move around then, autonomously. And then they can stick to each other and build structures like this, structures that are strong. Um, so the so these systems are quite exciting, but the big difference with the swarm is that in a swarm you can use this physical principle of alignment to create collective behaviors, which people have done with robots. But now in this modular system, the only thing that you can do is create iterative like reconfiguration. So you move like one unit at a time at the edge to change the configuration of that thing. It's not like a continuous system. It cannot be described as a material like I
Okay.
refer when I was talking about the swarm robotic system, I was referring to the idea of a polar liquid. So it's a weird liquid, but it's a sort of liquid. Polar fluid, I should say fluid because a fluid can be a gas or a liquid, to be more
Okay, so
general.
the way I see it a little bit is like a computational, pure computational system that has a physical manifestation, or a system that's physical and does maybe some computation, but its main laws are sort of like continuous and physical.
Well,
Right?
it's an interesting point. It can be actually both. Like if you think of birds flocking, what the the rules that make them interact are not just physical. There is probably some physical aspect, but it's behavioral as well. So
Yes.
it's related, it's cognition. So related to the eyes, the angle of view of the eyes, and then they want to align with each other, and then there is some physical effects that arise when you look at the entire system. In particular, birds have a response time. They need what we call a comportment, like behavioral inertia. They need some time to react to an impulsion from like to perturbation from the trajectory of their neighbors, and they only rely on neighbors. And
I
in the
see.
birds, when you have a predator, the birds who see the predator will just start to move away. The other one don't see the predator, but there is a wave of information propagating through the flock faster than the actual
Movement.
speed at which the birds are moving, which is quite impressive, which is just an effect from this comportamental, this behavioral inertia
Amazing,
that
amazing.
physicists have studied, Andrea Cavagna and his team, forgot the name, Giordano, anyway, it's some people in Rome at La Sapienza with this beautiful work on birds. And so, uh, and at the same time, you can find systems like even robotic systems. Like I'm thinking of uh, another paper. There is not many actually, but I'm thinking of another paper published in Science Robotics a year ago um, with robots that have some physical. There is a mechanical trick in the system that allows the system to switch from one state to the other one, and we change its motion. And that's a physical, purely physical. outcomes. Then they use also some behavioral approaches in the system to create like a swarm that can somewhat learn so
Like
that's
collectively.
yeah. So
Mhm.
but generally the collect the physical aspect emerge when you look at the assembly. And it's more rare to look at physical interaction at the local and in modular systems, cohesive systems, because of the systems that are stiff and that are more discrete, you cannot have such behaviors. And so you have more like a iterative, like an additive like approach of reconfiguration.
Yeah, yeah, it's
So you
discretized, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, discretize.
Uh-huh.
And so that was a big novelty about my system, is that I wanted to somewhat create a link between the physics of soft material, the physics of metamaterial, and the and the and the f- and robotics and embodied intelligence. Like somewhat bringing some principle, the same kind of approach in that you have in swarming, where you have a interaction that lead to collective behaviors that are useful for the swarm to solve a control problem. I wanted to bring that in the modular robotic world, but thinking in terms of the machine is the material. Like, like people who are interested in metamaterials, they like in compliant mechanism, they were like thinking in terms of the material is a machine. So you take a piece of plastic, you make holes in it, and then you can create mechanisms that can deform that system in a way that you cannot function. Okay, so the material is a machine is like kind of like the big idea behind the field of compliant mechanism and metamaterials. And so here is kind of like going the other way around, saying the machine is a material, and trying to, and at the end that's what biology does. So that's
I
the
see, I see, I
connection with
see.
biology. Like
Okay, so the just let me understand. So the material as a machine is like a big chunk of something which you deform or you make holes in it or you alter, and it becomes a machine, does something because of what you did with it. And what you will do, that we will explain, is that you make the components and they get together and they will become material, basically, sort of like
Yeah,
right?
a material, but it's a material that is still a machine. So that's the thing. So
Yes, yes,
the
it's
the,
amazing. Yeah.
the machine develop a form of decentralized embodied intelligence
Mm.
and use the fact that it's also a material to be a reconfigurable material and adaptable system with yeah, the ability to comply. So of course in my system it's about mechanical compliance, but I think this principle could be pushed to a more physical form of energy.
So maybe
So
let's describe your system. Do you have a? Can you show it a little?
I have like this.
Because I will link the
I,
video and your paper, of
I
course.
have
But yeah, so this
I
is
have one
the
here.
basic. Okay, so it's like 3 centimeters, something
Yeah,
like that.
it's
Yeah.
basically I can't. Oh, yeah, it's like 1.5 inch, I believe.
Uh-huh,
So
uh-huh.
I don't do centimeter
So little
much.
two little wheels with two magnets inside, right? And the
Yeah,
motor.
but it's a weird design. So that design was developed to serve that conceptual purpose, where I was trying to so this is the first figure somewhat of the paper, where I'm trying to develop a framework that combines the physics of soft materials, the behavior of soft materials, like in terms of the mechanics of a material, with control. But
Mhm.
control here is a very simple thing. Like it's just simple feedback loops, where I use like an encoder that is inside. We cannot see it because I would have to unscrew that part, but there is a little encoder that track the displacement of the rotor. There is only one actuator. There is only
Uh-huh.
one motor side. that move this rotor.
I see. So the
And
two wheels move independently.
yeah, this one move completely independently. This one is just here
Huh?
for stability.
I see.
This one is motorized, and then on the other side, you have a passive magnet that is completely free as well.
Hmm.
So the lower wheel is connected to the motor,
Mm-hmm.
is here, and then this one is completely free, and
Hmm.
this one is also completely free.
I see. Okay, so they move
And
by
with
physics, basically those two.
yeah, and so
Uh-huh.
when you bring that one, this motorized actuator close to the passive one, they have opposite sides, so they can stick to each other. And
Mm-hmm.
then by moving this actuator, sorry, I'm trying to be,
Yeah.
by moving this actuator, you can basically
Ah,
change
I
the
see.
angle of that thing.
I see. I see. I see.
So with this, and so the design is made in order to connect the physics of a material with I mean it's more the response of a material, like the properties of a metamaterial with a robotic system with a concept of controls. I design a system that can where reconfiguration can happen
Uh-huh.
in a continuous way, a little bit exactly like if you think of a pile of sand, like a wet pile of sand. When you deform it with your hand, you can to the shape that you want. And now, and the grains are moving around each other in a continuous way. They can take all orientation possible. That wouldn't work with Lego. So you need to have
Yes.
like grains that can move around, right? And then the idea is instead of using your hand now, if you put little motors in each grain, uh, how can a very simple system just made of one actuator, how can this system um, basically reconfigure itself and develop its own autonomy and intelligence? That's the way um, I am asking the question here, a
I see.
research
So yeah.
question
So
around embodied intelligence.
your main goal was sort of scientific, to try to see what such a system can become.
Yeah, exactly. And at the end, there is a design, there is a trick, there is a somewhat you could say that this is an improvement in modular robotic design. But at the end, it was really developed in the context of this conceptual framework. It was developed to
Mhm.
demonstrate this framework.
And maybe because maybe it's not completely clear to the listener, so you put these a lot of them together. It's not just two little wheels, but a bunch of wheels that then can move on top of each other and create structures.
Yeah, exactly. And in aggregate, so I mean that's clear when you see the video. In aggregate, as a result of some frustrations that appear in the packing of all these units, uh, with just a single actuator, you can also have sometime actuator that move away from the magnets, and so they can detach. And
Mhm.
that's a result of the packing of the collective configuration. And so the system can do an actuation. The robots, when the motor is on, that thing can move autonomously. And when they form aggregate, so when they get close enough, they attach. So they are self-assembling, but they can also detach because they can use the frustration of the configuration. And so you can have like a robot, a given aggregate that divide in two, and then you have two separate aggregates that can do their own thing.
Yeah, yeah. So I saw in the videos things where they make like a ring, and if depending if it's odd or even, they can move like a wheel, or maybe there are two that are here and one in the middle, and then they can both move in the same direction. It's really funny how many
So these ones
little thing.
that's when the self-organization come into place, because at the end, if it was just a system that could behave as a liquid or as a solid, it's a metamaterial, and it's not yet a robot. So how do you span the whole range of behaviors that goes from a programmable metamaterial to autonomous robots? it's by using self-organization and the fact that you have a collective state that emerge and that can be perturbed. And this perturbation give rise to what I call self-coordination and a function. So these states that you're referring to are a situation where I am like implementing uh, a certain control, simple feedback on each unit, which basically make every unit behaving as a spring to make things
Spring.
simple.
Ah,
So
okay. Uh-huh.
I could literally replace every motor with a spring. Yeah, and then basically they just behave as springs. There is
Uh-huh.
no
Uh-huh.
communication,
Uh-huh.
wireless communication between the units. And you, so if every spring is exactly the same, you have synchronization like metronomes. You know the experiments with metronomes like on a like a piece of cardboard. Um, if you slightly change the behavior of the of even just one oscillator. So you have this also with metronomes. Is if one of the metronomes have a slightly different frequency, slightly different behavior, then you will still see synchronization.
Mm.
You will still see some self-organization, but it's not necessarily synchronization. Um, but you will definitely see that tendency that has every oscillator to bring back by transferring an impulse, like mechanical impulsion in the system, to bring back the one that are off
Ah, I
in
see.
in
It's
the
amazing.
overall.
Okay,
So
okay.
so the basically the in the metronome when you slightly change the frequency of one metronome, like you slightly change the position of the little weight, you still observe synchronization. So now I don't want to push the analogy too far. They are quite different systems. Uh, But what happens is that if you change the frequency, the property of one of the oscillation in the assembly, so you have a system that first synchronize, then you change the oscillation, the properties of one oscillator. You will still observe self-organization, but not synchronization. What you observe instead is the propagation of a wave in the system,
I see.
and this wave translates into a periodic deformation of the system. And basically, I use this periodic deformation to do locomotion.
Ah,
So you
okay.
so you could think of an algorithm of optimization, machine learning, like that just change that change the one parameter in the oscillator to slightly change its frequency, and that would create an oscillation, and eventually when you find the right value, the system will just start to move.
Okay, so if I think about it in evolutionary terms, it could be that like the big system wants something, we can go there later, but let's say for now that it has some goal and the little the component systems just change their local behavior and somehow sometimes some kind of emergent behavior emerges, right?
Yeah. I mean, the evolution is an optimization process. So that's the
Yeah.
parallels that you can do in that system. Now, obviously, my system doesn't have a particular goal, and at this point, it's just like physical interaction. There is no I haven't implement. I have observed ingredient that's like minimal ingredient of decision making, but I haven't done experiment in this system that demonstrate clearly decision making with a specific in a specific task.
Ah, okay, that is
Although
yeah.
that transition to synchronization is what we call the subcritical bifurcation, which means that there is an hysteresis, which means that when you increase one parameter, the order parameter that makes the system goes from disordered to synchronized to self-organized, the moment, the value of the parameter, when you go from low value to high value, the moment at which you transition to the other state is means this value is larger. Sorry, I'm gonna do it again. The value at which you transition from a disordered state to a self-organized state is larger when you go from lower values to higher values than when you go back from higher values to lower values. So the transition point is different. That means that between these two values, there is an area, there is a range of parameters that we call an hysteretic behavior, an hysteretic regime, in which the system can be in both states, either synchronized or not synchronized.
Wow.
And that can be switched from environmental perturbation, basically. So
Ah, I
that's
see.
an
Oh.
ingredient. That's an ingredient, a minimal ingredient of decision making that people have connected to some neuroscience, like some neural behaviors in like I've seen experiments in fish from people looking at in yeah experiments with fish under some stimuli. There is these people in Constance, I in Cuisine. I don't know if you heard of this lab who study fish, and like there is this paper that they published a few years ago where they look at bifurcation, subcritical bifurcation and decision making in fishes. So that's something that is exist like that is an
Uh.
identified mechanism, and
So
that
I'm
I
just
can
thinking about,
recover.
how
Yeah.
to, because it's a really complex subject. So what perhaps the direction we could take is just explain first the emergent properties of the collective. Like you talk about liquid, solid, uh, and other kind of states that you can describe the whole system, right? And it's based
Mhm.
on how we describe liquid and solid in physics. So so what do you mean by that first for this kind of collection of wheels, and how do you make them happen?
So how do okay, so how
How
do
do you
I
make
make
solid and liquid, for example? Yeah.
yeah.
And what does it mean that they are solid or liquid?
Yeah, okay, so and then how do I use it via self-organization? So
Yeah.
okay, I guess there is some overlaps between different concepts that are important to maybe clarify. So first of all, what is a liquid? A liquid is a system that deform, and when it deform, it's a system that when deforming dissipate energy and
Ah.
doesn't come back to its initial position. It's just the energy is just dissipated. So every energy that you put in the system to deform it is lost, and like in heat or whatever, and at the end the system stay how it was. So you take a liquid that you throw on the ground, it will just spread and stay there. If you take a solid material, when you deform it, it store energy, and this energy is restituted um, in the system when you release the force, and the system go back to its initial properties. Okay, so that's the first thing. So and there is a very simple analogy between this and control. So if you take a solid, if you just take a spring basically is a simple linear model of elasticity. It's just a spring. So of course, in a spring, you have like the displacement of the spring versus the force, and that's a proportional relationship. In linear elasticity, you have the stress and the deformation of the material, which are tensors. So it's just a three-dimensional version of that spring, but basically it's exactly the same idea. So a solid behaves somewhat as a spring, and
Mhm.
um, and basically that also what you do when you implement a proportional derivative. Uh, that's what you do when you use proportional control. Proportional control is that you have a target value, and the further you are from this target value, the higher
Mhm.
the torque that you put in your system to actually bring the system to its equilibrium. Okay, and so if you just use proportional control, what happens is that if you're I mean, in practice, when if you put a term that is too high, your system will go very quickly to the target, but it will tend to oscillate around
Mhm.
it. So what people do in order to kill this oscillation, they add what they call a derivative term. And the derivative term is analogous to damping. So
Yeah, like in
in a
the car, you have a spring, but you
exactly.
also have a damping. Yeah.
So in a physical system, in a physical system, you if you take a spring uh, that with like a spring inside a viscous liquid, for example, you will have an oscillator, like basically a damped oscillator,
Oh, yeah.
and that's the same thing.
You put a
So
spring in like honey, and then it's just.
exactly, and so this dissipation term is basically a liquid behavior. It's
I
equivalent to
see.
a liquid behavior, while the spring is equivalent to the elastic behavior.
I see.
And so somewhat you can do a very simple analogy like this, and that analogy so it's, of course it's this analogy is it's a one-dimensional analogy on a material that is a three-dimensional, right? So it's a it's a very strong simplification. The reason why it works in my system, it's because the coupling between the units is made such that this analogy that exists at the local level, when you implement this proportional derivative control just on the magnets, so they just implement some this behavior there, and you force it. But then via the coupling, the system respond collectively, and it can respond collectively as a liquid, because when you only put dissipation, for example, then you can also add a bias term that allows the system that allow every unit to roll, to turn. Then when you do that, you see that with a specific this simple control approach, the units self-organize in a way that basically if you just put it, take it with your hand, it will just flow like a liquid, and you can actually change an effective viscosity just by changing
I
the
see. I see. So
a
it's
term, bias term.
like I can imagine, like there are those weird materials which are solid, but they break and they come back to the original shape, or basically when we make plastic, right? We heat them up. It's liquid, so it can take any shape, and then it cools down and it's solid. So it's an
Yeah,
interesting
it's a
thing
viscoelastic.
that we can go between the two the way
Exactly,
you
it's like a
want. Yeah.
viscoelastic material, and you control the behavior of the material of this aggregate as material by changing the property of the control loop at the local level, and that's what I illustrate in the third figure of the paper, where you see these phase diagrams with like cubes, colored cubes, and depending on like these just three parameters, you get a different behavior. And where the feedback aspect, the cybernetics aspect come into an interesting play, is that the behavior, these material-like behavior, are in response to environmental load, are in response to
Ah,
perturbation. So if you take an example, is like cornstarch, for example. I know if you've seen on YouTube people running on cornstarch,
no.
on cornstarch swimming pool. You have a swimming pool
Ah.
filled with cornstarch, and you can run into it. So, actually, one of the big world expert of cornstarch is Henrik Jaeger, with who I worked on this, with who I published this
Hmm.
paper. And so what is very interesting with this system is that and which was very puzzling, and they are the one who brought very an explanation for this phenomenon. Basically, if you pour your hand in cornstarch very slowly, it will flow like a liquid. But then
Is it,
if you smash it, then you will break your hand. It's just it will the material will respond
solid.
as a solid, depending on the way you solicitate it. And so, and that's important, because then if it depends on the environmental, on the external load, then you have this feedback component with the
Hmm.
environment. The material can respond differently depending on what is coming from the environment. And that's how and at the end, you can use the body itself of the system as a sensor, in a way, as
Yes.
a
Okay.
distributed sensor.
Amazing. So So this is in principle, or you've done experiments of this type?
No, I've done experiments on this side. This
Uh-huh.
is what we demonstrate
Okay.
in the paper. For example, you can have you can find gates, locomotion gates, and the system just flow around an obstacle when it's liquid, and when it's solid, it's like when you turn up the spring part of each in each unit, then you get this synchronization. The
Hmm.
oscillators that are synchronizing, and then this is when you can get this locomotion gate. So this locomotion gate might also pass obstacle, but by being soft, by deforming like a soft matter around the obstacle, not by flowing around it. But more importantly, what we showed in this system is that with these oscillators, you have a single mechanism to drive the system, to create collective behaviors, to create self-coordination. And then if you change the environment, you do the experiments on like a silicone anti-slip mat. Like I use the mat that I have here, and then I did the experiments on the wood floor, on my wood floor, which is very slippery. And you have to change the parameters, but that's something that could be taken care of by an optimization algorithm, right? But what is interesting is that when you look at the system, the way it moves is different. Like the physical phenomenon that create locomotion is different in both cases. So the system is able
Hmm.
to implement different strategies, different physical strategies to create locomotion in different environments, but from the same very simple principle of self-organization based on these oscillators.
It's fascinating.
That's the last figures of
What I'm
the
thinking
first
about is
sequence.
like you still control each wheel, right? So there is some kind of algorithm that controls the wheels,
So
like some
the
parameters in the wheels, right?
way I do the experiment is that I just send one instruction at the beginning, which sets the behavior of that spring. And
I see.
then in that spring, so in that spring, I can change the strength of the spring. I can change the damping, and then I have a term that I call the bias that can either add to solid friction or cancel it, or even be a negative friction, somewhat a negative friction, which corresponds to which makes the basically the robots just oscillate by themselves.
Hmm.
So you don't have to push it in order to start the oscillation. It's just self-oscillate.
Oh man. Okay.
And in that regime, the unit communicates via mechanical impulsion, and this is when they self-organizes locomotion gates. And so I don't have to send in continuous information. I just send them
Hmm.
once, and then they do their thing.
I see. I'm constantly trying to find analogies. So I don't know if you know Michael Levin's work. He's a
A, a little bit. I mean,
yeah.
I have a friend actually who did a PhD with him on the on robots.
Yeah. Okay.
So I heard
So he's
the
a
stuff. Yeah,
fascinating researcher. He's,
yeah,
I think, originally a computer scientist, but he works on development of biology. So he works with this kind of systems, but from the living world, and
yeah.
but very much an engineering approach. And his point is basically that if you want to do developmental level manipulation of tissues, you have to understand what's happening at that level, not necessarily the genetic level, and you have to understand what the cells want by themselves. And so he does a lot of experiments to actually figure that out. Like he takes out like skin cells and sees what happens if they are alone, what is their like original programming, and also manipulates the sort of high level information in animals that can grow their body parts and reprogram the growing sort of algorithm. It's amazing, like grow two heads, and even the sort of like computational concepts emerge from this. Like he has memory in cell collections. He has counterfactual thing like you can reprogram a flatworm. You cut it into two, and it grows two heads because you
Wow.
reprogram the electrical code that pushes the development of the two heads. Now you can also do it and not cut it, and it will never grow two heads. So this
Yeah.
information is there as an as if, or what will happen if I cut it, but it's never actually realized.
Yeah, it's connecting developmental biology with synthetic biology somewhat, right? And bringing
Yeah.
morphogenesis in the picture of
Yes. Exactly.
computation, embodied computation. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. So,
Yeah.
and from this, what emerges is a picture where you have these sort of levels of behavior and control, and there are certain things you have to do at certain levels to control the whole system. And
Mm.
I mean, the applications are numerous, but what one is, for example, to reconstruct lost body parts. Like if some animals can do it, maybe if we manipulate ourselves, we can regrow a hand eventually. So that would be like the long-term goal, but the sort of like the philosophical thing, which fascinates me a lot, is that how do these levels communicate, right? So what we study mostly in science is for sort of the bottom-up thing. Like we go really to physics, and from physics to chemistry, and then chemistry to biology, and then we assemble those things and we see things emerge. But there is also a different direction from bottom up, which is usually manifests itself as a constraint coming from the higher system to the lower one. And so this is, I mean, I'm not even sure what question I could ask here, but do you see any phenomenon like that where the because of, like, let's say, the environment effects on the whole system, you have a different behavior or a constraint on the lower parts that wouldn't be there if you didn't have this like higher level impact on the system?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, somewhat there is a tension. I mean, I don't know if that's the right word, but like somewhat a tension between uh, the evolution in terms of design, which does use a top-down approach because like there is somewhat problems to solve in the real world. But at the end, in a world that is made of building blocks, right? So at the end, top-down is what we do, what people do when they do engineering, right? And so physicists, that's like scientists in general, that's true. They tend to understand. They look at complex systems. They are trying to infer what are the elements that the idea of like, I mean, understanding a system, understanding the mechanism behind it goes through the reproduction of what we see and like by touching at the building blocks, right? Either by doing gene alteration or that kind of approach, right? At the end, it's an epistemological problem, right? Because uh, the science of complexity tell us that uh, first of all, self-organization is a multi-scale
Mhm.
thing, like, and definitely when you look at birds and you can make physical model that doesn't care about the detail of the of how cognition emerge, show that there is some frontiers in this
Mhm.
multi-scale pictures of self-organization, right? And that's quite important because otherwise probably we wouldn't be able to get such complexity in the behavior. And like at the end
Uh-huh.
we do have we are made of cell. It's a distributed system, but we are able to build to have differentiation and have very different parts in our body with very different functions. So it's like and so I would say that somewhat uh, my approach is a bit similar in what Michael Levin is doing with development biology. in the sense that I'm trying to look for physical phenomenon in systems that are only physical at some point. Like typically I'm using like robots and motors. That's I'm using digital computation there. So
Mhm.
at the lowest
At the
at the
lowest level,
lower
yeah,
level,
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
still using silicon like
yeah.
um and so somewhat there is and we are trying to bridge a gap between a top-down approach to create intelligence where we want to reproduce features like learning in a
Uh-huh.
world that is made of building blocks, right? And at the end, that's what evolution did do, right? It's like bringing these two approach. But the challenge that we have is that there is no purpose behind evolution. Like it's just a self
Yeah,
emerging
that's yeah, exactly. But the
phenomenon.
purpose is survival, and survival of what? Because at the different levels, you have different bodies. So in a
I mean,
certain sense, yeah.
many features that we see in nature are probably just there for random reason, and they are not subject to any form of pressure. There is like I mean, of course, it's
Mhm.
difficult to demonstrate it. It's easier to demonstrate uh, uh, competition, for example, and someone like a like a species disappeared because of some change in the environment. That's 1-0. That's a very simple, and that's also why evolution was so. The perception of theory of evolution was so biased toward competition, and it was harder to see symbiosis and co-evolution, like how species
Mhm.
can help each other. Like, but at the end, it's a much more yeah. Sorry, I lost the what I was going to say, but uh, sorry, what I was saying, I
Yeah,
lost.
yeah, I'm not sure, but what you know just comes into my mind is this liquid analogy, like almost like long run species flow into the ecological niche and they fill it, right? And that changes the niche
Yeah,
too.
yeah, there is definitely so yeah, a symbiotic, and so that's in environment. Yeah, we're talking about we're talking about the pressure from the environment. Like at the end, a lot of what we see around us is not subject to particular. It's probably not
Mm.
subject to particular pressure. It's probably just a random
Mm.
uh, effect. So
Yeah,
and
growth. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Hmm.
yeah, so and the other question that is connected to that is um, there is a path to life that we can witness, that we can study, and like, but is it is it the only possible path of life, right? So I mean, it's and from the very first level, like what other form of life could exist, and that kind of the perspective that bring artificial life as a field, and people
Yeah.
thinking about artificial life, and probably also uh, Michael Levin is thinking about around this line also in the context of synthetic biology. Um, how do you is there alternate form of life that
Absolutely, yeah.
also
So yeah, so there are some things he does on the actual biological substrate, but there is also the question of the principles that we could reproduce with other. Yeah.
yeah, and in the context of robotics, it's also a way to not stay constrained by the biomimicry, like the
Mhm.
idea that because I mean obviously
Yeah,
it
yeah.
makes sense to mimic biology. It's very inspiring, but
But yeah,
how far can you go without necessarily being inspired by biology, just from very simple physical principle and information principle?
yeah, and for me the paradigm is still very different because you said okay, physics is like bottom up and engineering is top down, but when we do engineering, we usually try to avoid complex systems because they are hard to control. And so the point of Michael is that And actually, why it resonated, I will explain you why it resonated with me. I'm working in telecommunications and the AI. And so what we see emerging is a world where every technological object will have AI inside. They will all want something. Like, let's talk about like a phone, a video application. I want something as a user, and the phone is designed to satisfy my need. For example, not to break the video in the middle of the conversation. The phone asks for bandwidth from the antenna, the base station. It starts to be intelligent. So it means that I'm watching a video. It tries to predict what's going to happen within the video. It tries to predict what I'm going to do, where am I moving, and if it knows that I'm moving away from good signal, it will want more buffer. So it will ask more bandwidth from the station. The station gets this information, and then it can decide to give it or not. It has other goals because it has to satisfy all the customers in the area. So what you start to see is this almost like organism-like systems emerging in tech, where nothing really controls anything directly. So the base stations, of course, cannot control what the phone does for technical, but also like privacy reasons. So it can only have a soft control on the phone, like how much bandwidth I give it to it. And of course, the phone doesn't have any control on the base station other than asking for more bandwidth. And so this is like a very simple instantiation of this world where we will see these layers of different agentic technological gadgets that will all run AI inside and try to do something and want something. So they will be much easier to model as agents than as machines, right? So
As
engineers,
what? Sorry.
it will be much more advantageous to model them as agents than
Yeah.
model them as machines.
Mm.
Like machines, if you want those that we can control, like the robots, like classical hard robots, they still, okay, they have some oscillations and stuff that we have to manage and try to bring back the way you explained, but it's still a machine like I have an actuator that I can control the voltage on, and it's direct, whereas in this
Agent,
kind hmm?
agent, you mean that a machine that has behavior, and you don't look at the details of where this behavior comes from,
That's
right?
yes, and it has goals, it has sensors, and it has actions. So basically like a little
Mm,
control system that
I
tries
see.
to adapt to its environment and tries to reach a goal. Yeah. And so this is how so Michael has this paper, it's called TAME, Technological Approach to Mind Everywhere. And it comes from biology, but I think it will appear in tech. And so this is the reason why I was so interested in your paper, because what we are looking for is actually experimentation with simpler systems than like a phone network of a city, which you obviously don't have access to, where this sort of like phenomena can be studied. And so
Yeah.
Michael had three questions to you actually. That I very interesting. So the first one is like you mentioned emergent properties like liquidness, solidness when you change local parameters in the wheels. Did you have any surprise, like a surprising high-level property of the system that you didn't expect, or something that emerged that surprising?
Yeah, I mean, actually, these behaviors were a surprise. I mean, I moved to this project with intuition, like really.
Ah,
So of course, you don't tell the story like this when you write the paper. It sounds like everything is well. I moved really. So I like to. So I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion the question like how far if you put a motor inside the grains of a pile of wet sand, how far can you go to make that thing intelligent? That's really where I started from, and I like to mention this at the beginning to make the mindset a bit clearer, because at the end, the synchronization was a surprise. I mean, now that I
I
see
see.
it, maybe that makes sense. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Like I could have expected that maybe, but at the end, I built this system more as an experimental. Like I basically the way I design is that I have an intuition of ingredients. Um, there is a physics that I want to explore. Um, Of course, I did some research on viscoelastic materials and self-organization. So all these concepts are part of my research already. But I move more with an intuition, and I basically build a monster that I looked at, that I played with, and eventually some behaviors emerge. But like the there is no clear expectation when I started to. Actually, I was trying to just to comfort myself. I was trying to think about what I could do with this at the beginning. If nothing surprising happened, like what could I do with it?
Uh-huh.
Even though generally I build system with a desire to do discoveries, right?
Mm.
So I'm actually looking for that. Like
Yeah, so it was a bet.
yeah, it's a bet. I mean, I think that every good research project
Yes, it's a
is a
bet.
bet, is a
Yeah,
risk, somewhat
yeah, yeah.
conceptual risk that you take, and based on intuition. That intuition just is a way to chase something, find a specific direction in an ocean of parameters. You cannot you cannot say you cannot support intuition with a model.
Mm.
This point. That's the point. You are going in a direction that is more risky and adventurous. So if you would have a model that would be less adventurous. So and at the end, I had some stuff in mind that I could do
Mhm.
more like using a behavioral, actually more like using a more higher level agent based system, and I put some accelerometer in my circuit board, so I could measure vibration. Initially, I was thinking about a system that could measure vibration locally, and
Mhm.
depending on this vibration, you build behavioral models with like agent communication to react to a vibration, like
Ah,
you have
like
a shock, for example.
the whole system
Yeah,
would react. Yeah,
like you have a shock, for example, on an obstacle, and you can propagate information via the accelerometer that each unit has, and just do something to pass the obstacle as a function
I see.
of the obstacle. But that was way less ambitious, because at the end, the system I have is just completely, there is no information processing. There is no digital form of information processing.
I see. I see. So basically, the liquidness, the solidness, they emerged, and then you just observe them, and then you probably had some feedback, no? Like
So yeah. So
yeah.
I knew that I could make the connection rigid or soft
I see.
by changing the behavior of these motors. Also, this came up. I already had some first some first uh, uh, some first prototypes. Like the very first prototype I did, I was just thinking of that my pile of sand. I wanted that thing to be able to reconfigure in a continuous way. So I was thinking more like material, and I was more like thinking, all right, the control of that thing, I'll figure it out when I go through that. But eventually, I thought about um, uh, like encoding these loops, these proportional derivative loops, changing the parameters to go from a dissipative regime where like you deform the
Mm-hmm.
basically here a motor can be deformed in a
Mm-hmm.
dissipative way. If I push
Mm-hmm.
like this, it doesn't come
Mm-hmm.
back,
It stays
right?
there, huh?
And that can be implemented in a passive way. So if I don't do anything, if I take my aggregates and I push on it, it will flow like almost like mayonnaise,
Yeah.
like ketchup, like a yield stress material,
Uh-huh.
something that need a force to flow, or like toothpaste. And you can also adjust this dissipation by just changing the derivative term. But at the end, it will be the same. You just change somewhat the viscosity of your
Yeah,
thing,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then just by that, but just for the contact, I was just thinking in terms of contact. and I implemented the possibility to bring in the spring, the proportional term. But that was just the local behavior. When I put them together, the fact that they were self-organizing into something that would allow me to make a direct connection between the behavior at the local scale and at the global scale
I
with
see, I see.
somewhat of viscosity or somewhat a global elasticity. That was that was a big surprise because you need the system to behave like a continuous material to like somewhat transfer information so you can all the deformation that you put on the aggregate is like distributed evenly within all the units. And I mean, so it requires this specific coupling. No, I don't have a quantitative connection between the local behavior and the collective behaviors. That's
Mm.
further.
And so did you try mixing different types of local behaviors and see what happens? Do they
Yeah, so I,
cluster?
I I did, and that's how I discovered the locomotion gates.
Ah, okay.
So I had like the synchronization, so I was like, oh, super cool. But then I was like, all right, but that thing doesn't do anything. Like, it's just they are just oscillating. Like I don't know if you saw the video. I have in the paper there is supplementary videos, and one of the like the third one I think show the synchronization. So you have
I
like
see.
a bunch of these things that are oscillating like this, and they just synchronize together like metronomes. But if you put that vertical on the floor, the thing will just like move a bit like this, and that's it. Nothing happened. So that's when I started to play with that, like change the parameters. And then what was very surprising is that I still observe frequency locking. So the frequency of all the units is the same, but the amplitude, the phase is different. And so that translates into that
I see,
very
I see. So
regular
so you had like this
propagation.
this little change in one of the elements, right?
Yeah.
But did you try like mixing the solid type with the liquid type and see what happens? Or something interesting?
This is a
Yeah.
good question. I haven't, but I think it's interesting to try it. I think it would be interesting to try it, definitely. You
Oh
can, I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
I only have 10 units in all the
Ah, I see.
experiments, but
Okay.
so it's a pretty coarse-grained system, but in a bigger system, I mean, you think,
Ah,
yeah,
okay.
that would be very
Okay,
relevant.
because
I mean, you think about the human body, all the different properties that we have
yeah.
in a given body, and you think about a system like, I mean, in the context of more complex tasks, that's something that we want to leverage actually. Like typically, you want to grab and place, like pick and place. Like might have part of the body that is solid, and then part of the body become more liquid, so it can just take the shape of an object, and then you make it solid again, so the object is like uh picked, and
Ah,
then
yeah,
you
yeah,
move
yeah,
along.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's
Then you
like
get yeah, and then you become more liquid when you pass an obstacle. It's possible also to think
mm,
about that in terms of by like a system with active units and passive units. Like
mhm,
not
mhm, mhm,
every
mhm.
building
Yeah,
blocks need to transform energy.
yeah, 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 yeah,
Mm.
yeah. Exactly, like nerve cells and skin cells, yeah, and muscle cells.
Yeah, yeah,
So
somewhat, yeah.
the second question, I mean, I think we talked about it, but basically the question is that you can control these things locally. Is there any reason or any advantage to look at the top level system and try to do control there?
So sorry, can you repeat the question?
So you control the wheels locally, right? You can manipulate the parameters, etc. But then there's this emergent behavior of the full system. And then there is the question whether there is any advantage of looking at the whole system as a system and try to invent actions at the top level, like trying to control the behavior of the emerged system, not the components, or at least look at the behavior. So that's where I'm saying that we talked about it, because when you look at it as a solid or a liquid, that's actually a descriptor of the behavior of the full system. Question is, what control mechanisms we could have on the top level, like on the system level?
Yeah. Yeah, no, so it's a very good question. It's a very like far ahead. Like it's at this point, in order to do that, I would have to develop probably some sort of understanding. But on another hand, so I mean, I see two different aspects here actually, and one perhaps is one you have in mind, which is, can I take my system as it is, not touch any local parameters, and just by choosing the right way to disturb it, make it do what I want, right? And but at the end, it's there is a ultimately you need to go back and forth between the two levels. I would say that this would be an achievement to to get a system that have such uh, versatility that
Mm-hmm.
you just have to decide how you disturb it in order to get what you want, right? But at this point, for example, the synchronization level, I don't think you could get much from that. Although
Mm-hmm.
maybe, I mean, okay, maybe it could be possible actually if you are very intrusive. Like for example, you bring some materials that block some of the oscillators,
Mm-hmm.
and then that thing. But at this point, and you could block several oscillators at the same time, maybe. And at this
Mm-hmm.
point, you're gonna see your system start to oscillate.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe there is some actually conceptual experiments that could be done around these lines. Uh, but the way I see it is that in order to really go beyond just conceptual ideas and like get the system to on this principle to actually do real world tasks, something that can be comparable to what biological systems do very well or other robotic systems do very well. I think there is a back and forth
Uh-huh.
like exchange to
Yeah,
do between
absolutely.
the
Yeah, 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 yeah.
bottom-up design and top-down. But ultimately, I agree that it's great. It would be great to have a system that I can control just from external perturbation.
Yeah, and where you could actually ignore the what the local
Yeah,
things do. Yeah.
local
And if
control.
you can do this, because if you have only 10 wheels, of course, it's not possible. But the way that the levels emerge is that when then you have a second level, which is sort of independent of the first, it doesn't care about how it's implemented, what it wants to do. Then you have recursion.
Yes, that's the part where I'm. At the end of the day, it's a physics principle that is underlying all this like this
Mm-hmm.
self-organization behavior, and the result that you get from this self-organization is always going to be connected to these building blocks, the behavior of these building blocks. So,
You would need some
I mean,
control loop, no? Like
you don't
feedback.
need necessarily, you wouldn't need the control loop, but the behavior of your system will be dependent on the actual parameters that you have in at the local level, right? So what the system doesn't care is the details in the silicon system, right? What the physics is going on in the silicon. That
Hmm.
is separate. Like basically in biology, um, you could describe your system with behavior without thinking about, like you take a flock of birds, you could describe your system just from the behavior without needing to look at the biochemistry, right?
Yeah, yeah, and
But
there is this notion of intelligence is where you have a goal, and intelligence is when you can reach that goal through different path. So if you have a higher level goal, and you could imagine that you have a system with different proportion of the different kind of local parameters, and then they can still sort of self-organize to reach the goal different ways,
yeah,
maybe. Yeah, that would
yeah,
be
okay, so
possible.
I see what you mean. So in that sense, the detail, the dynamic
Hmm.
doesn't matter because the dynamic is a detail in the system. What matters is that can the system eventually find a way, like if I block some gears, for example, can the system can eventually find a way to move around?
Yeah.
And it can have several different possibilities. And the dynamic doesn't matter. That's how you describe it. Yeah, yeah. So then that's that's possible. Yeah, I guess that's possible to do that with this system. I haven't explored behavior. I mean, this is a very high level. That's very interesting. I would love to explore this kind of like
Uh-huh.
almost thought experiments, like but
Do you have a
with this
simulator
with a model system.
for this? Do you have a simulator you could play with in?
We don't, but we have been working on that to do. That's one of the that's a plan that we
Okay,
would like to develop.
we'd love to play with
It's
it. Yeah.
we tried, and it was a bit complex. I mean, the question is like, do we do a model that is reproducing exactly all the mechanics of the system, like a
Mm-hmm.
physical model, which then is quite complex with all the mechanism, or do we do something more effective? But
Yeah, I mean,
then
you could have both. Like you could have different levels of simulations because yes, I agree that if the goal is to actually have a simulator where you do something and you reproduce and it does the same thing, it has to be pretty close to physics.
yeah,
But if you just want to play with, I mean, I would love to play with like a more synthetic simulator which has easier dynamics inside, so faster to compute,
yeah, yeah.
and where we could actually do a lot of experiments of this
No,
type.
that would be good. But in order to really make that connection between the physics principle and this embodied
Yeah, yes.
intelligence,
Yeah, you
I,
need
I
to.
would I would see that this is very important to actually build like
Mhm.
a very realistic simulator.
Uh-huh.
And so that's but it's mostly a human resource problem at this point
Yes,
because
yes.
I am more an experimentalist and I've been
Yeah.
focusing a lot on like developing this thing. I have also some other project going on now, and so but that's one of the plan. I mean, I've been like discussing more and more with people from the theory and like simulation.
Mhm.
I mean, typically simulation like what Josh Bongard do, right? Who is also a collaborator of Michael Levin, if I'm not wrong. That kind of
Yes, 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 yes.
spirit is like that kind of models, like bringing like physical element in that kind of model for self-modeling and trying to bring uh, distributed approaches,
Mhm, mhm,
the
mhm.
kind of thing I would be interested in developing, definitely.
So last question of Michael, and it's pretty. That's I think the most
Mm.
like. Okay, the question is, what does the world look like from the perspective of the agent, either the bots, the individual ones, or the collective? Like, can we imagine that? Like the sensors are if any, it's mechanical, right? It sort of responds to mechanical pressure, so it doesn't have any other, like there's gravity and there are other objects around, right? So yeah, I mean both would be interesting. Like what does a little wheel see, and what does the
The
collective?
aggregates, yeah. No, that's a very interesting question. So, what does the aggregate see? Uh, depend on its state,
Hmm.
and that's important. That's and so at the end, the way I
Hmm.
see it, like just a way to convey the big picture, is that depending on the amount of energy that the system is able to restitute to its environment, the system goes from a programmable material, metamaterial, something that is passive. You won't see it moving, but at the end, when you move it, it still reacts. It's still its behavior is changed by the parameters in these feedback loops, right? All the way to an autonomous robots, when you can transfer enough energy that give this robot its ability to move,
Hmm.
to 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 locomote, to really
Hmm.
move
Hmm.
like
Hmm. Hmm.
and um and in in that span of energy transfer to the environment, the system increase its ability through the dynamics
Hmm.
to sense the world, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take a programmable material, it will just see the deformations that you do with your hands, right? But in the autonomous robots extreme side of the range, when it's both the robots produce energy, enough energy, and the system self-organize enough. So this energy is distributed in the environment in a self-coordinated way. In that regime, the dynamic that the robots create give him the ability to sense the world collectively, um,
Mm-hmm.
to sense the world. So, for example, if you pass an obstacle, that obstacle uh, is 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 I mean the robot is able to deform around that obstacle
Yeah,
to
and
pass
it
it.
gets information from it. Yeah.
So the robot sees the obstacle. I mean, it's not a camera or anything like this, but like at the end, it's able to see this perturbation.
Yes.
So, and at the individual level, I think the robots only see what their neighbors are doing.
Mm-hmm.
That's more how I would put it. And they are able to self monitor. They know how there is a little encoder.
Ah.
They know how they deform their arm, and that's important because that's how I can implement the spring. But technically, this spring is actually an idea of art installation that I'm working on. I want to replace these motors just with spring to make like kinetic art and like sculptures that you can just touch, and just give a kick to the system, and the energy is spread,
Ah,
is
nice.
redistributed in the system, and which self-coordinate, and the energy that you inject in the system is just restituted in a self-coordinated way to create locomotion. But even in that system, what the units see is the impulse from the neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
So perception come from dynamics at both level. At the local
Mm-hmm.
level, it's just from the neighbors, and at the larger level,
Mm.
the self-organization, the collective behaviors gives the robots the ability to
Yeah, yeah,
sense
yeah. Okay, okay. It's
perturbation
almost like,
from
Michael
the
has
environment.
this concept called the cognitive cone, where lower level systems have smaller agency in time and space. And when they self-assemble, it's bigger. And if you get to human level, we can, plan
Yeah,
ahead, years ahead. Whereas our
yeah, it's
cells are like really.
it's it's similar to that in a more physical way. I'm assuming that if you think in terms of biology, you can push that toward a very high level of cognition the more you build cells. But that's also a question like how much do you have to scale up a system in order to create more complex function? And
Mhm,
that's
mhm,
something I'm also would be very interested in exploring. But I don't know if this is exactly the system, but like the right system for that. But how hierarchies
mhm,
emerged. So you
mhm,
can think of bees, for example. Bees develop hierarchies, like there is different function, or just a human body, like or
mhm.
an animal.
There's a special
You have a
specialization in the hierarchy, right?
specialization, exactly. Like how does that emerge? And is there like
Mhm.
no like large numbers laws that allow to this kind of principle to emerge? Like
I see, I
do
see.
you need what complexity do you need in the system? What size of the system? Do you need, I mean, yeah, to reach such complexity? I mean there is in sociology, in cognitive science, there is some uh, there is this idea of like numbers, like caps, like yield. Like I'm thinking of I mean, it's just an analogy. I'm not saying that this is necessarily related, but people talking about the optimal number of connection you can
Uh-huh.
build, like real connection you can build in a society, like, and why people have done experiments with monkeys where they show that uh, beyond a certain number, it gets very messy. Like
Mhm, mhm,
if you
mhm.
get to, I don't know, it depends the species, but maybe 100 monkeys, they are able to navigate, to know each other, and to be uh,
Yeah.
connected to each other. And as soon as you start to grow bigger communities, people lose um,
Yeah, yeah,
become
yeah.
maybe more individual and less connected. And
Well, I
yeah,
mean, you lose individuality and you have to create aggregates in your mind that are groups or identities that are categories. That's
yeah,
how
yeah,
we
like
deal with
sub
it. Yeah,
entities.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
But I mean, just I was just referring to that because it's I mean, it's something I've been very intrigued by. How such universal number
Ah,
can appear in such complex system, and maybe
mm.
it's controversial. I don't know exactly what is the state of the art with this, but my impression was that this is a quite robust
Yes, I mean that, but it's yeah,
aspect.
it's an emergent thing, like the behavior of your aggregate, like it emerges from
Yeah.
local. So that's also this kind of surprises. Look, Baudouin, it was really nice. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your how you ended up here, because I know that you work a lot. You mentioned that you worked with art, you do art, and you work with artists, and it fascinates me really how you go between the two worlds of science and art, which usually are like have not opposing but like independent goals. Like, I don't know, science is looking for the truth, art is looking for the beauty. So how does it relate in you, and how did you end up in this position, and
Well,
why?
yeah, yeah, that's a good question. So it's interesting because um, that it's really my artistic expression that brought me to work on
I
this
see.
robotic project.
Hmm.
So it's like
Ah.
not saying that the link is necessarily direct in terms of causal link in the concept, but it's definitely related in terms of medium. So I initially I did my PhD and my postdocs working on self-organization, pattern formation. I was interested in
Hmm.
how physics emerge
Hmm. Ah.
sorry,
Yeah.
how patterns and how physics explains the emergence of patterns in soft materials. And I looked at different systems, in particular viscoelastic material and gels.
Hmm.
And I was always captivated by the visual part. Like I
Uh-huh.
started my PhD already interested in doing something very visual. And I'm a musician by
Ah.
even before studying physics, I was playing music and during my physics studies, I took a class on a cinema class where we
Hmm.
were doing like short movies. So I had this interest in audiovisuals, and what brought me to this field in physics was the visual component. And I was fascinated by self-organization since my master, basically, and excited about exploring uh, the poetic aspect of that, like trying to connect that in a poetic context with the emergence of life
I see.
and our visual identity that we build from nature, basically, that we have around us. So it's very interested in that connection. But eventually, I got a fellowship, like a scholarship for my PhD. That was very cool uh, on on a pattern formation experiments,
Hmm.
and that was a very exciting perspective. So I decided to just go with a research career. That PhD went very well. Um, I was very excited about what I was doing, and then I from there I got a fellowship to do a postdoc in the US in Boston, and then I kept doing uh, kept doing research on this system, shapes formation, with these gels. And eventually, at the end of my postdoc, I realized that I was not I kind of lost my original interest in doing some artistic expression. Of course, the career pace when you are a young researcher is there is a lot of pressure, and like doing well and like doing art is not necessarily something that is valorized a priori, right?
Yeah. Mm.
Your career path. So, and at the end of my postdoc at MIT, I decided to just take some time to work
Mm.
on art and going back to this desire of using self-organization in art. and I developed this performance work, this performance project called Shapes of Emergence that eventually with which I eventually developed the performance called Water Organoid that we premiered at Art and Technology Symposium in Paris last May, and that now we are playing in different venues. And initially, it started from my desire to do performance, to really show
Live.
self-organization
I see.
in live, like to show the time aspect of the
Mm.
dynamical aspect of shapes formation. And so I wanted to perform experiments in public in front of an audience. So I thought about doing some installation at some point, but eventually it was not really capturing sometimes the ephemeral aspect also that exists behind life. And so I developed this performance where I am using self-organization principle, self-organization experiments, a bit like a puppetry of an
Mm.
emerging life. So of course
Mhm, mhm.
it's fake, but
Mhm,
the
mhm,
experiments
mhm, mhm, mhm.
themselves are real physics experiment of self-organization.
But you have
One
some
of them,
control.
yeah, and one of
I
them
see.
is done in collaboration with a lab in Paris, actually, ESPCI, a researcher there. I collaborate also with another physicist, Séverine Attis, who is in Poitiers, CNRS in Poitiers. And then we work with three musicians, someone at the Ben Kinsinger at the organ, um, Otto Briner is playing the upright bass, and then we have Royel
Hmm.
Benitez who plays the drum and electronics, and another guy also in Chicago with who we play when we perform here.
And you do the visual with the music at the
Yeah, and
same.
so
Yeah, I see.
what is important is that the way it started is that I was very marked by my inspired by the cinema classes that I took earlier in my cursus. I'm really into cinema, and I developed this system, this robotic system that allow me to move a camera around when I do the experiments, to
Ah,
do travelings, like
ah,
in contemplative cinema. So
I see. Yeah.
I was very influenced by Godfrey Reggio, Ron Frick. I don't know if you heard of these filmmakers who are doing like contemplative cinema. So
Uh-huh.
famous movie. There is a famous movie, Koyanis Katsi, who
Uh-huh.
was
Uh-huh.
with the music by Philip Glass. This kind of stuff. Like I was very inspired with this. With like you have very very slow camera
Hmm.
motion and with crazy landscapes. But here it's everything is macro. So I'm looking at small
Ah, okay.
droplets
I see. I
or
see.
small liquids that are expanding. But at the same time, you don't have any notion of scales when you look at that. I'm projecting it in very big. I'm
Mm-hmm.
looking at very small object. When you see the liquid spreading, sometimes you just the illusion it's you don't really know if you are like in space
Ah,
or if you are looking at the formation of a cell, basically. And that's kind of what we are trying
wow.
to give, like the poetic aspect that we're trying to give. And so that's how I got into robotics by designing this system,
And so
and I was visiting
by poetic you mean creation, right? Or in the
poetic. I mean, like it's a form of poetry. Like I could use words, I could write a poem, but I
ah,
use images and a live performance with musicians.
I see, I see.
We,
So it's
yeah, so
okay, okay. Because when you were speaking, I was thinking about like you have like this nice triangle between science, engineering, and art, where there is a scientific method through engineering where we try to recreate stuff and try to learn. Like the whole, in a certain sense, the whole AI project was fueled by that desire to understand intelligence through recreating it, right? And that's an
yeah,
engineering
definitely.
approach to science, right? And art is also about creation that
No,
makes us
totally.
understand something, right?
And I think this is where, yeah, it's very interesting point that you mentioned here, and that's how I see it. Like, so I started from science out of curiosity, but the way I think at the end is as an extension of thinking by doing, it's thinking by making, right? It's like really like, and not everyone is like this. Some people are more theoretical, but like in science, generally, people are more theoretical, conceptual. For me, like it goes through making, and that's why from science I naturally drifted to engineering and art.
Mm.
And at the end, you get inspiration from application in science, but of course, if they come from industry, they can be very constrained. Like you have funding to do one thing, and it's not necessarily like a completely free exploration. But art also bring ideas of application that just and they just come from like poetic purposes. So, for example, I wanted to build this robotic system to do my
Mm.
traveling. So, very concrete example, like very pragmatic. Like I want to build a system that allow me to do travelings. So I spend like 5 months just working on that, like an engineer, like just building my system that I could drive with a little gamepad during
Mm.
performances. And so from that I developed my medium and then I started to think about robotics. And then I
I
started
see.
to think,
Ah,
all
so
right,
that's
so now
I see.
I'm doing self-organization. I was already interested in like
Amazing.
non-biological intelligence system. Like I did these experiments where I was growing some branches, but branching patterns, and I was trying to play with gel properties with light
Uh-huh.
to see if the branch would do optimization. I was trying to build like physical form of
I see. I see. Like physical option, I
intelligence
see.
somewhat. So I
Energy
was interested in that.
minimization. Yeah.
And this
Wow.
project worked in the sense that I published. That's my MIT project. Like I published a nice paper, but like I couldn't go that far in it's more like a soft matter pattern paper. But the goal was really to do something like this. So now I had like skills in robotics,
I
and
see.
so I was definitely interested in like pushing that, especially in the context of installation. And then I started to talk with Heinrich Jaeger, the professor. So I was a visiting artist at that point in the James Franck Institute, and I
Mm-hmm.
was doing a residency in a contemporary art
Mm.
center, Mana, and we started to talk with Heinrich about
Hmm.
robotics and soft granular matter, and that's how I came up with this idea
Yeah.
of developing the Granulobot. So
What an amazing journey.
it's there is a lot of serendipity there, not a lot of
Yes, I know, but
planning,
that's
but
how it is. Yeah.
that's how it happened. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So the art is very important in that picture. And now I have many new ideas that come from art, and my science idea give me ideas to do new art installations. So
Mm.
around this idea of self-organization, like I developed this other robotic system with little
Uh-huh.
robots that make vibration on surfaces, and like I was basically I made an installation of little vehicles that play music together basically. So
Hmm.
that now is in my project for my application, my job application, to make a system where I can measure with vibration. I can measure exactly the environment and the behavior
Uh-huh.
of the robot, so
Uh-huh.
I can like develop a framework of embodied computation that take into account
Ah,
the environment, the physics of the environment. So these ideas are completely connected, and art for me is a methodology also of
I see.
exploration,
Yes,
conceptual
yes,
exploration.
yes, yes. It's a nice way to put it. Okay, well, it was very nice. I usually ask my guests at the end to ask me one question.
Yeah, so I guess I had two questions potentially, but if I have just one, maybe I start with the one that intrigued me the most, the way you approach me. You refer to this idea of like TAME, that's the
Yeah.
framework that Michael Levin proposed. And so I was wondering more in detail, like what is the link with my system and how my system could help test some ideas that are in this theory.
So,
That's that.
so yeah, that's an amazing question. I will try to be brief, but I am a big fan of Michael's work, and he's very good at explaining these really complex things very simply. He has a lot of YouTube videos, and his papers are also very nice to read. For me, at least, I mean, I completely understand what he's talking about. And then at my work, I see emerging this kind of systems, and I really think that engineering systems will go into that direction. And then when I looked at, so basically, Dani Barabashi, I don't know if you know him, he tweeted your paper
Mm-hmm.
because he reads, I think he has a program of reading one paper every week or every day, I don't know. And he I really like to see his tweets because it's all kind of, you know, around AI, and but also the peripheries like this. So he tweeted this and I looked at it. I didn't understand what it was, but I looked at the pictures and I understood that these are self-assembling systems and self-assembling robots. And so sort of like I made this connection without actually going very deep into it. I just thought that it would be very interesting to explore this angle because, you know, so one of the, it's not yet a project, but it's an idea we want to do in the research lab, that to find a sort of minimum toy system on which we can see the properties that Michael is talking about. I think he's working a lot on this. I mean, his latest idea is pretty crazy. There's just a sorting algorithm where you have like an array to sort, like an integer array to sort, but you have different type of sorting algorithms, and he assigns different algorithms to the different elements in the list. So when they have to swap, they execute their algorithm, and he shows like all kind of strange behaviors emerging from this very, very simple computational system. So he is also looking for this kind of minimum examples of emergence and constraints from above. And so I thought that your system, if we have a simulator, we could definitely look at it and try to find in the space of control tasks and maybe, you know, ways to implement TAME. Where what I mean by that is that you need at least two levels, where the lower level doesn't see everything, as you mentioned, it just sees the neighbors. It has these goals already, but it tries to achieve them locally.
Yeah.
When it doesn't see what the aggregate system wants, it sees its local goals. The aggregate system, on the other hand, it's also not a machine in the sense that it cannot control directly the lower elements of the system. It can only try to persuade them by maybe creating states around them that would make them behave that it wants to behave them. You see what I mean? Like the higher level has a
Yeah.
goal, it doesn't control directly the lower level, but it can control the environment, or maybe it can control the rewards that the lower level elements get to achieve a higher goal. So we are looking for like a minimum system that
Yeah, I see where I could go with that. Like it's like you have like local, you have like building blocks that have their own dynamics, and how can you
exactly.
shape that dynamics just with one button on each, for example, and your hands on the assemblies, for example. Like that's
Yeah,
kind of the idea, right?
yeah,
Um, yeah.
yeah.
So
And
that's actually no, go ahead.
no, so there are a lot of things we could demonstrate emergence, we could demonstrate top-down constraints, and we could also maybe, that the intuition is that these systems will be more robust, basically, to breaking the parts or to environments that they've never seen, because that's like sort of like a philosopher's stone of consciousness or artificial life, is that you want systems that can generalize beyond the environment where they learn their models or their behavior. It's maybe Mike Stone's stuff, where this is like one kind of test for consciousness. So these kind of things, I don't really have any like very specific
Specific.
engineering goal here, but I think that if we could have like such kind of system, a lot of things could be demonstrated on it.
Yeah, in a very simple, maybe it's too simple for this framework, but like I do think in terms of like how can I have a system that like that's what I'm doing now, like to control that aggregates. How can I use perception at the local level uh, for the global behavior to be optimized, for the global behavior to like if like, in a very pragmatic way, what I'm trying to do is to um, use local sensing for the robots to for the aggregates to do a locomotion gate. So I don't have to choose the right parameters. The system, each robot is able to run its own little optimization, and that optimization uses is able to be done based on an error that evaluates a local form of
Yeah.
sensing. But this local form of sensing has to embed a picture. It can be a very, very distorted picture, but a picture, some bias that come from the behavior of the global
Yeah,
of
yeah.
the
So yeah,
global
so
system.
exactly. Yeah, like the interaction between the levels is really interesting.
And that's what biology do with
Yeah,
proprioception, basically. So I'm trying
yeah.
to implement this kind of concept in the robots, like trying to infer the global behavior just by using local sensing or local communication.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
And so this potentially fit in this picture, but uh, the idea of like minimal consciousness and being able to extrapolate from the given environment what might happen later, for example, that's something that is quite far from like uh, I don't have a physics model, I don't have a model experiments to do that with this system. Like it seems like easier to do that through simulation, but the robots at the end is in between a simulation and and a physical system, because you can the behavior of each unit is something that you can code. At the end, I can test. I can use this system as a simulation. The only thing is that I run it in the physical world. So
Yes,
I
I
cannot
see.
run it faster than the typical mechanical characteristic time, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
if something can converge relatively quickly, if the because the optimization at the local level can run very quickly, the problem is like the whole system. So at the end, if the goal is to implement something that move, it doesn't necessarily require it won't necessarily require a lot of time to run, as long as the algorithm is relatively efficient, which is also a good way to filtrate relevant approaches, right? Because life will choose the shortest path, right? So yeah, that's
Okay. Okay, well, it's been more than 2 hours. I think it's one of my longest podcasts, but it was really,
ah,
really fascinating. I really like
but
this.
you can cut, huh?
No, I won't. I will cut the technical stuff, but the rest is gold.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
Thank you for having me.
yeah, thank you very much for
It was my
accepting my
pleasure.
invitation, and
Yeah,
let's keep in touch.
yeah, definitely.
Okay, thank you, Baudouin.
Bye, Ballas.
Bye
Have a
bye.
good day.